morning, everyone. We are now live on Facebook and live in our webinar on Zoom. Glad to be with you again this beautiful fall Sunday morning. My name is Holmes. I'm the scholar in residence at First Presbyterian Church of Atlanta. And as always, joined by Brennan, who is an Old Testament professor at Columbia Theological Seminary. And we have the great privilege, I can't even speak this morning, privilege of being joined this morning by Dr. Mitzi Smith, who is a New Testament professor at Columbia Theological Seminary as well. So we're just really representing Columbia this morning, and we are glad to have you both with us, and hopefully lots of your alums and you know, maybe even current students. So good morning to you both, and welcome.
Good morning. Great to be here, Chris. Thank you, and Brennan for the invitation.
Of course, we are blessed to have you with us. Thank you so much for taking the time, making space to share your great wisdom and knowledge about the New Testament, and today especially about Mark chapters 8 through 10. We are so grateful. And also, if people out there have not been following Mitzi Smith's series of Womanist dialogues on YouTube and also on her Facebook feed, please check those out. You can Google Mitzi Smith or type it in YouTube and find Womanist Dialogues. There is a series of really fascinating conversations, hugely instructive, and many that focus on New Testament, but also widely about womanist theology and contemporary issues. But also, Dr. Smith has written many different books, many different articles. My favorite, Womanist Sass and Talkback, a fantastic study of different New Testament texts interspersed with a conversation about contemporary issues. There's a fantastic chapter on the issue of water in Detroit. So, I mean, there's, you know, there's huge, wide array of conversations there that are fantastically interesting and illuminative. But also the author of a New Testament introduction, co-author of an introduction to the New Testament, also the author and editor of a handbook on womanist interpretation, I See God in Me. So many different things. But Professor Smith, we would like to ask you a couple of questions just to start off. The first we ask of everyone, and we generally ask guests to share some kind of presuppositions or assumptions or kind of hermeneutical lenses or glasses or ways that we all intersect with texts or things that inform the way that we dialogue with them. So what are some of the ways that you personally, perhaps culturally, perhaps theologically, perhaps in scholarly terms, but how are some ways that you have been informed help you read the biblical text?
Thank you, Brennan. Yes, I think one of the most important ways in which I read is as an embodied Black woman, right? And what that means for me personally, and what that means for me as a collective part of a community, the African American community, and beyond, right? As a Christian, as I would say, I guess, more progressive Christian, progressively progressive. And my emphasis on justice, right, and contemporary issues frame how I read. I think it's very important that we read with privileging contemporary justice and other issues that affect everyday people in the pews, in our neighborhoods, in the world, because God is a living God. So that is, I believe God is a living God. God's Spirit is alive and walks among us and inspires us and is not an idol that is fossilized in a text or in the past.
Right. Yeah.
Amen.
And we also ask sort of as an introductory level question, if you would mind sharing with us and the folks joining us some of what you're working on. We know that you're on sabbatical in COVID, which is such a weird time to be on sabbatical, but are there any writing or research projects that you would like to sort of share or talk about, things that we can be on the lookout for from you?
Yes, so writing is slow during this pandemic. There are days, right? You know how I feel.
Oh, yeah.
There are days where I feel like I can't even focus, right?
Right.
That I just need to get out and walk. And I feel
Right.
so anxious because so much is going on around us, and just trying to calm myself in different ways. And then by the time I do that, it's like I don't feel like spend so much energy trying to calm myself and to deal with other stuff. But anyway, let me share with you an essay that's coming out. It's finished. I understand the proofs. I haven't seen the proofs yet, but they should be available soon. There is a book that is edited by Jamie Reeves out of London and David Toombs. I think that's how you pronounce his last name. And it's called When Did We See You Naked? And I'm very proud of that essay, an essay I wrote for that volume. It should be out early 2021. And, it's not normal for us as biblical scholars to begin our writings with our personal stories. And I do begin this with my personal story of child sexual violence, right? And it's connection with silence in the church and looking at the crucifixion of Jesus and how silence has been sacralized, and comparing the crucifixion with the lynching of Black men and some women, and not all, there were white people who were also lynched as well. And what, in terms of sexual violence, trying to uncover those pieces and what type of sexual violence that Jesus may have endured. And I do say, which is shocking to some, and I did allow my summer class, the students in my summer class, to read this essay ahead of publication. And I think what shocked them the most is my statements that perhaps Jesus was castrated, right? And most students were kind of, shocked, but then, yes, I can see this. But maybe two particularly, especially male students who had a more difficult time with it. And they were white male students, let me say that. And part of my response was sometimes what doesn't enter into our cultural imagination, right, extends to the way we read biblical texts, right? Because it certainly is in the cultural imagination of African Americans that Jesus, that people who were lynched were castrated. There's a book out, Lynching, and some of those photos kind of demonstrate that, but also looking at some of the ancient
Practices.
Evidence and so forth for that. And even the Gospels, right? There's this notion of putting Jesus' clothes on and taking them off, right? And there was a guy who, and I can't remember his name, who survived lynching. I think I'm telling you too much, but I'll stop in a minute.
No, this is brilliant, and it ties into what we're doing to talk about today. So yeah, this is great.
So the guy, there's a guy was lynched, I believe, in like the early 20th century, who was the one person who survived. And when they found him, his clothes, he had all his clothes on, right? So evidently they had castrated him and put his clothes back on. And comparing that to kind of what happens to Jesus when he is stripped, right? And he's in this, when this happens, he is surrounded, guarded by, right, ridiculed, violated by a group of hyper-masculine men, right? And so we don't know, right, what could have happened. And the whole idea of crucifixion, right, that most of those who were crucified were slaves, and it was meant to be a spectacle. So we could imagine that it went beyond just mere beating, right, that all kinds of torture And we cannot rule out sexual violence of many different kinds of sexual violence, I think. And so thinking about that, what does that mean for people today who experience, men and women who experience sexual violence, right? And why does it become a problem for many of us to even suggest sexual violence, let alone castration, when we highlight so much the disgracefulness, right, of crucifixion, right? So I'm looking forward to that essay coming out. I'm very proud of it. Got some good reviews, 3 very good reviews from the blind reviewers on it, and I'm just proud of that essay. And so it's good to shock.
Yeah, well,
to shock folks in the meantime, right?
It is true that that within the Christian church especially, I mean, there's this kind of reticence to name some of the things that are very clear for the ancient audiences that have to do with sex and sexual violence. I mean, in the Old Testament too, what I teach, the character of Daniel, or the character, if you think Nehemiah, these other characters that are very likely have been castrated. That is, that Daniel is a Jew working in the court of a foreign king, and the same with Nehemiah, who's a cupbearer to a king. That these folks were quite often castrated before they began their work in the court of a foreign king. This was a typical practice in the ancient world. It's even prophesied in Isaiah that this is going to happen to the nobles who when Jerusalem falls. But people are reticent to talk about that. But also, it's interesting how, that Jesus talks about eunuchs and the various ways that people become eunuchs. He's not ashamed to talk about this, to name it. But also, I mean, that sense of lynching and violence and this kind of both display, but also a kind of an ashamed, like not talking about it that we see in U.S. culture. I feel like that intersects with the way that, like, the chapters 8 through 10 and the way that it's been typically divided up, but also this other theme that runs through. I mean, typically Mark chapters 8 through 10 have been divided up with these 2 issues of blindness, right? These 2 occurrences of a miracle of someone who cannot see and then comes to sight by Jesus's intervention. And typically it's been about kind of the identity of Jesus in this through line of kind of that at the beginning in chapter 8, we have this blind man there's 2 stages of sight, and he comes to see, and then the disciples slowly come to see something more about Jesus's identity, typically associated with Messiah, right? But there's this other through line that Jesus seems to be at pains to tell his disciples about, and that they refuse to hear. They hear the Messiah part. They don't hear the part about suffering and violence and death. But typically that's been taken in Christian tradition as like this, I don't know, this kind of like, yes, I will resign myself to suffering for the gospel. And almost in a sense like Jesus wants it, or this is a good thing. God likes this, or God appreciates it. But it seems like in your work, there's a through line that says, no, actually, and this comes from womanist scholarship more particularly, but I mean, that suffering is not, God doesn't want this. This isn't good, right? So perhaps we can structure our view of 8 through 10. Can I ask this general question? I mean, about Jesus's suffering, he seems to say, no, we have to suffer. Peter says, no, we don't want to, right? We don't have to, or that's bad, right? How can we understand Jesus's repeated discussions about suffering and not glorify the suffering itself, or a kind of valorize especially other people going through this, on my behalf or something? That's a typical part of white American Christianity. Is like, there are lots of people suffering out there, and that's a good thing, right? But then I kind of benefit from it in some way, right? I mean, me personally, right? But all to say, Professor Smith, how can we understand this this notion of violence and the suffering that Jesus talks about, the cross that Jesus talks about, without telling people that they should kind of grin and bear their suffering today?
Yes, and feel free to call me Mitzi in this context.
Thanks.
So you mentioned womanist. So Raquel St. Clair, she was St. Clair when she wrote her book, wrote a womanist reading of Mark, right, called Calling Consequences. And yes, before her, womanist had pointed out that we need to stop glorifying suffering, right? Because it's sort of a double burden, right? And it tends for Black women and for poor people and for all kinds of people who suffer, right? Is just taking their suffering that may be the consequences of injustices, right? And by glorifying the suffering, you glorify the injustices, right? That cause the suffering. But Raquel St. Clair writes that what happens, the way she sees what happens to Jesus, what Jesus is saying, that suffering is a consequence, right? It is a consequence of living, per se, we could say a counter cultural, that is when culture is quite oppressive, right? A countercultural lifestyle, right? That is loyal to and that embodies and conducts oneself according to how we understand the justice and love of God in the world, right? And so it is a consequence, right, of that. And too often, though, we weaponize, right, the personal suffering that may be a consequence of selfishness, or maybe a consequence of wanting power, right, to oppress other people and so forth. Even as Christians, I think we see it in this context, weaponizing suffering. Oh, we are Christians and we are suffering because we're Christians, and that suffering becomes because we don't get our way with suffering. Right. The trivializing also of certain experiences as if they are suffering connected with living a Christian life. Right.
Yeah. Well, and it's so complicated, this question of Christian suffering, because. On the one hand, you can have people use a phrase like, well, this is just my cross to bear, which could be like, oh, I stubbed my toe, it's my cross to bear. Or it could be somebody in an abusive relationship saying, well, this is just my cross to bear. Jesus said I was going to suffer, so I can't really resist this. I can't really fight this. And what I hear you saying with Raquel's work, who incidentally was our guest last week,
really?
On our series.
I'm sorry, I missed it.
But that it is suffering that comes as a result of following in the way of Jesus. That is sort of, in a very narrow sense, seems to be the sort of suffering that Jesus maybe doesn't endorse, but says that the disciples should anticipate. And that then outside of that narrow box of suffering, we would actually work to, we might be called as Christians to work to resolve that suffering, right? Or if it's injustice or if it's suffering that comes as a consequence of injustice, then the church is called not to accept it, right? But to actually work against it and work for justice and liberation. Is that kind of?
Yes, and it becomes more complex when who decides, who interprets what it means to follow in the way, right? Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, so for some people, it's I'm going to be careful. Well, I used to be a Seventh-day Adventist, right? We all have these, right? I don't want to just pick on Seventh-day Adventists, but I used to be one, right? And so if anything encroached upon our ability to worship on Saturday, right? If the boss said you had to work, then that was suffering, right? To the point that if, for example, a young woman and in our church, I was an elder at the Seventh-day Adventist, had a young woman who came, she was running from a violent, fleeing from a violent relationship, had a single parent looking for a job. She found a job working in the prison system. She had to work on Saturday. And what were we doing? Trying to tell her that was not God's will. Right? And so just anything that encroaches upon doctrines, right, are human made, right? Let's be real. Our theologies are human because they are for us. Reminds me of the Sabbath is made for man, not man for the Sabbath, right? And so, for humans. And so anything that encroaches upon those things, we can say, well, we are being persecuted. And we focus on that persecution, and we focus on our own personal dissatisfaction with inabilities to practice certain rituals and so forth as suffering, and those become even more important than the injustice in the world, right? And it blinds us to how we are complicit or actively involved in injustice.
Yeah. And it seems to me too, like, I mean, Christians often interpret the suffering as kind of coming from God to test us or to like prove us or to make sure we make the right choices or something like that. But what Jesus seems to be talking about is, that this is something that's going to be put on us, and that we're not going to look forward to it. And this is not like a spiritual endurance test or something, but it's that people are going to try to kill me because of what I'm saying and what I'm doing. And it seems to me like throughout these two chapters as well, you see this, who is the greatest, this stuff about kind of leadership and dominate, are the people, Jesus is teaching an alternative theory of power and of an alternative structure of society in which children are, people who are weak and vulnerable, et cetera, like they're privileged in Jesus's eyes in some way. But also this idea that people who, if there's a different way of structuring power, then that's actually what Jesus is after. And it seems like that's also what scares Rome. Like this is what brings on the actual punishment, right? Is that power structures in Judea and power structures in Rome and throughout the Roman Empire are worried about Jesus's potential here to upend the way things work. So if that, in other words, like where does our suffering come from? Does it come because we are actually threatening structures of power that keep people oppressed, or is it coming from, there's this kind of pretend war on Christmas or something, or that someone told me that they didn't like my cross decal or on my car or something like that, right? But I mean, and getting that Jesus does seem to Jesus's death is not a good thing in the Gospel of Mark. I mean, this is a like you said, a shameful thing, and it seems like Jesus's kind of reticence to tell people, hey, share this message, ties into that too, right? Jesus is kind of worried that people are going to misunderstand this or something. The messianic secret thing in Mark. I mean, is that part of that might come from this shame that Jesus is, and like the negative impact of the suffering that this is going to bring. Maybe, I don't know, but anyway, that's my ramblings about this. But in this section, we have a couple of places where kind of traditionally Christians have spent a lot of exegetical time and effort. We have Jesus's discussion of the cross, which we mentioned a little bit, but also the transfiguration, this huge part of the kind of liturgical calendar throughout Christian history and so on in many different traditions. But what do we do with the transfiguration? From an Old Testament perspective, I look and I see like Elijah. Jesus tells his disciples, about this way of suffering, but then we see this kind of alternative here. Moses and Elijah show up on the mountain, the law and the prophets kind of embodied, but also to people whom God has taken their lives early in some way. I mean, Moses dies on the mountain and God hides Moses's body so it can't be worshipped or venerated. But there's also this kind of tradition that maybe Moses is out there hiding somewhere. And then Elijah, of course, taken up into heaven in the beginning of 2 Kings by the fiery, with the whirlwind and the fiery chariot. So he's maybe going to come back. So this idea that these figures who have been brought to God's presence are like validating in some way who Jesus is. But how do you all read this text? What does this mean to you?
Yeah, it's difficult. I had a student ask once, how did they recognize Elijah and Moses? That's a good question, right? Because I would imagine that there were other folks, there were other folks that were perhaps in the resurrection tradition, right? So what made them think it was was one of these two, and how did they recognize them? It's just the narrator wants us to understand them. Maybe when it says they were terrified, well, Peter did say, let us build altars, right? So I wonder if it's connected, if there's a connection between when he asked them, who do people say I am, right? And some say Elijah, when the prophets, I can't remember whether Moses is considered a prophet in Mark or not. I know in some of the Gospels it is. Was this a way to say to them, look, I am not one of them, right? So all three of them now are in the picture, right? And so you can see, and you can tell folks, you know, I am showing you, not just telling you, that I am not Moses, I am not Elijah, that I am perhaps who Peter has said I am, the Messiah for this age, right? For this time, God's Messiah for this time, right? So it's difficult. I think it is difficult.
Yeah. I think the thing that strikes me, especially about the transfiguration in Mark's gospel, is, you know, this should be like the high point of the gospel. Like if we think about like cultural expectations, like, hey, a voice from on high, you know, this miraculous transformation, you know, there's no ambiguity here, right? That this is the son of God, you know, in verse 7, this is my son, the beloved, listen to him. We as readers have known this since, you know, 1:1 or maybe since the baptism, but the disciples don't get it. And yet, if we know the Gospel of Mark, we know that the next 4 or 5 chapters are really going to challenge whether or not the disciples can hold on to this, you know, and they come down from the mountain. Of course, it's only 3 of the disciples. It's like this inner circle, but just, again, wrestling with Jesus's identity, and, you know, whether or not the Jesus who appears on the transfiguration, can we hold that in tension with the Jesus who's going to be revealed on the cross? And, you know, who he's already pointed to himself as, this is what's coming. This is going to be the way I show up as a Messiah. And I can just imagine, for me, it gives me, the disciples get a really bad rap in the Gospel of Mark. And it gives me a little bit of empathy for them to have like this mountaintop experience, you know, literally, and then to continue to have to wrestle with who this Jesus guy is going to be, and where the story is going to end. So that's one of my takeaways with it as well. Just what a place it holds in this gospel.
So I'm wondering, yeah. So I'm wondering too, Brennan, is, you know, as you talked about, Jesus identifying himself also as the Son of Man, right, which is very mortal, right? Mm-hmm. And then Son of God. Does that mean he is more divine or not? Right. I have my opinion, but I wonder what you think as a Bible scholar, because Moses was not God. Elijah, they could be transfigured, but that doesn't make them God, right?
Yeah. I mean, when I read this as an Old Testament person, these things are all connected in my mind, at least in some way. Like the idea of Messiah, right? I mean, that verb in Hebrew, mashach, meaning to pour oil on something, just to set something aside for God's special use, like the menorah in the temple, a priest, or a king, in the Old Testament, and that, of course, that develops more like kind of into a particular technical term over time. Someone who's going to rescue Israel as a nation and do God's special work in some way. But I mean, that being connected to Son of God, which, by the time of Jesus, people are thinking, perhaps in terms of, in the early church, people are thinking of, the kind of a genetic relationship between God and Jesus, or something like that, But in the Old Testament, this was linked to the idea of messiahship, because a king who was anointed would be called the Son of God. So, like Psalm 2, which is a coronation psalm, you are, like this idea of kind of adoption, like that God adopts the Son. And so 2 Samuel 7, like the covenant with David, God says, you're going to be a son to me. And then the one who succeeds you on the throne, that'll be my son. And then that'll be my son. So God has lots of sons. sons in the Old Testament, and a daughter, right? One queen in Judah. But all to say that this idea of kind of being it's a symbol in a way of God's special relationship with this one person through whom God is working in the best of instances to try to create justice and peace, in the worst of instances to make violence and mayhem, as we all have experienced in certain ways with certain leaders. But in any event, that being tied, this idea of Messiah and Son of God are kind of tied together in my mind, and then Son of Man is a little bit different. I mean, when I read this, I translate this Hebrew phrase as mortal, because the phrase son doesn't always in Hebrew mean a biological child, or it doesn't often have anything to do with gender. That phrase son of can mean like a little piece of. So like sons of rock in Hebrew is pebbles. So that is like a piece of a type, or like what sons of Israel is often a translation of this phrase in Bnei Yisrael in Hebrew, but it really means Israelites. People, little things that are part of a bigger type or a bigger category. But so Son of Man is really just mortal, like mortal one. And it comes from Ezekiel, right? Ezekiel's referred to as mortal one in order to show the distance between God and humans. Yeah. Like this person is not a God. Ezekiel, you are immortal, right? And then you see this in Daniel, like meaning the Son of Man, or the mortal one, will come from the clouds, meaning that God is going to bring salvation to Israel through these kind of mortals, that people are going to be a part of this, are going to participate in God's salvation. And that's interpreted as such in the rest of Daniel 7. The angel tells Daniel that this is about the people of Israel. This is the Jews that are the son, the mortal ones, through whom God is going to effect righteousness on earth. And so then when Jesus is using that language, I mean, is the fact of in Daniel, it's used to say like, hey, God's going to work through surprising means, people you don't like, something you don't expect. It's going to be people. It's going to be a human being. So like Jesus emphasizes his humanity in using that term throughout, and Messiah would be understood to be a human term in this day, in the day of Jesus. So like, that Jesus is continually emphasizing his humanity and his suffering, which comes as a result of his work, right? His work to create justice. But then there's a lot of stuff about the kind of divinity of Jesus in these sections, but Jesus seems to be kind of tamping that down. So that leads me to wonder about this. When Jesus says, who do you say that I am? That's often been interpreted as like Jesus trying to teach his disciples through asking some really good questions. But then even after the transfiguration, Jesus says, who do you say that I am? Moses and Elijah are in the same position as Jesus in the transfiguration, but they're people. So here's a question, is like, is it possible that Jesus is actually, I mean, if we take seriously the idea that Jesus is a human, could Jesus mean something else by these questions other than just like, I know that I'm God, so what about you?
Yes. I think it's possible he's trying to figure it out too, right? Yeah. I mean, he's human. He is trying to figure. I think in Mark, he is very human. I want to say it's a shame that when we hear daughters of God, we don't think divinity. Mm-hmm. Only when we hear Son of God, we think divinity. Right. That's a shame. That has to do with the patriarchal context, I think.
Yeah.
And I think like in our modern context, and some of this has to do with like the quest for the historical Jesus and the lives of Jesus in the last 200 or 300 years, it's always people are trying to argue for the divinity of Christ, and we sometimes when we read the New Testament, we assume that that's the same sort of rhetorical and theological work that's going on. But there are even writings in the New Testament, I think of 1 John, where like the divinity of Christ isn't even a question. Like they're arguing for that, or they assume that. The problem is that Jesus was actually human. So that's the problem in 1 John is, I can't believe that that a divine being would actually have a real body and would actually suffer and would actually be human. And so I think it's possible, even in the world of Mark, that this is a direct emphasis that Mark is trying to tease out, is that this is the one you call Messiah. This is the one you call Son of God, is this very human one. The Common English, Brennan, translates Mark 8:31 instead of Son of Man as simply the human one. the human being.
Yeah, that's good.
And so, just that we can't, it took 300 years for the early church to figure this out, but that we can't emphasize the divinity of Jesus in such a way that we evacuate his humanity.
Yeah.
And Mark seems to be holding on to that humanity in a way that some other parts of the New Testament don't, and certainly contemporary Christianity doesn't always want to hold on to. To tell people Jesus was really, really, really human, just didn't seem to be human, is still a challenge, I think, for certain circles.
Yeah. It's interesting, Chris, that you mentioned John too, right? And it's considered, when Jesus is considered more God, right?
Right.
But that tension, right? When he says, you as human beings will do greater things than I. Right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Surprising thing to hear. Yeah. Yeah. So speaking of great and greater, we have a couple of stories here that are about kind of thinking about position and relative authority, and people kind of lusting in a way after position and authority, and Jesus kind of frustrated with the lack of understanding that if Jesus is a Messiah, that means I'm going to get lots of money and power, and like that. You can see Jesus's friends, James and John especially, thinking this is going to be awesome. We're going to sit as kings, right? We're going to be like co-kings or something, or we're going to get lots of fame out of it, whatever, But Jesus seems to be very upset with this approach towards thinking about rank or honor or rewards from doing this work, or et cetera, like where Jesus kind of planned at the end. What do you all do with these two? And I mean, I guess you can kind of link in the stories, or at least I maybe I'm wrong about this, but I kind of saw the stories about childhood and children kind of linking into this notion of upending systems of hierarchy, but I might be wrong. But how do you all deal with these stories, especially in chapter 9, verse 33 to 37, and then there's a little bit about kind of like this guy who's doing work on casting out demons with your name, but he doesn't know us. He's not part of our crew. Like he's not. That could be part of this too. This kind of like linking up with power and authority. But then especially in chapter 10, verse 35 to 45. I mean, so how do you all think about this? Does this have to do with the Roman Empire or Greco-Roman, or is this is there something we can learn from this kind of more generally?
You want to go first?
Big question. Sorry.
To Brennan. Are you talking to me or Brennan?
Oh, sorry.
I'm just kind of throwing it out there. Yeah.
Okay. That's the story of the healing of the boy is interesting. So I think first, and I'm not sure. Can we tell where is he? I'm trying to remember when he meets this father and his boy whom the disciples could not cast out.
Like geography, they seem to be like they come down from the mountain, but it's not exactly clear.
So I'm wondering, do we presume that he is Jewish or not? But anyway, the reason why I say that is because when I looked at, which comes shortly before this, up to our section, is the healing, the encounter with the Syrophoenician woman, right? Mm-hmm. And when I looked at that in the conversation between Jesus and her about the bread to the children, right? There are two different Greek terms being used. Jesus uses teknon and she uses paideon. And I think what we see throughout Mark is this back and forth between these two terms. Now, it could be that Mark is just using different terms, but I think that I think what would it look like if we looked at these terms and how he is using them when he uses these words, when he talks about children? Is he saying something about inclusivity, right? Including not just the children of Israel, but other children, right? Let those children come too, right? And I think about our current context in terms of migrant children, right? Immigrant children, and being open to various, to all children, right? Being very inclusive, and not just to the children of Israel, but children as children, and children from different ethnic groups. Let them come. But this story of this boy, right, is, and you mentioned in the notes you sent us this question about prayer, right, connected with his healing. I think you or Chris, Brennan mentioned this, and made me look at this again, right, this healing, this boy. Why couldn't the disciples heal this boy, right? And Jesus, using these words and then saying this can only come by prayer. I used to love this phrase. This can only come through prayer and fasting, right? And fasting is dropped off, and I think it should be dropped off, because obviously no fasting at this point going on. Right?
During COVID, yeah.
I used to use this, if I fast and if I pray, I can make anything happen. And we know how hard it is to fast, right? I find it difficult, and all this anxiety to even, I think about fasting. I want to fast, but I just can't, because my anxiety says you need to eat something. But so, I looked at this prayer, right? It is not the verb. It is not the verb we have here, right? It is not parsukamai, but we have here is the noun with the preposition. And I found that very interesting. That perhaps what we're translating as prayer should not necessarily be translated as prayer, right? Perhaps something like a formula, right? Because Jesus has a formula when he cast out certain words that he uses when he casts out, when he does exorcisms. And perhaps the disciples, I think he only did 2 before, and the first one he did, he hadn't chosen all his disciples yet. So maybe they hadn't caught on. Right? And perhaps it refers to those words, the particular words that Jesus used, the commanding of the Spirit, right? So that's when I looked at this again, right? That's what came to mind for me.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Other words that I really liked from this, that I believe help my unbelief. I've said that more times.
Yes. I love that too. Yes, I say that quite a bit. So it goes back to the humanity, of the disciples, I think. And I think Chris mentioned this. I don't see their not understanding, even the highlighting of it as something negative, but something very human, right? That distance between being human and divine, we cannot bridge that gap, right? We will never bridge it in terms of knowledge and understanding, I think.
This is so one of the things, and this is a curveball, so we don't have to talk about it, Mitzi, long if we don't want to. But when I was rereading this morning, I was struck by, so like in 9:16, the NRSV translates it as, "What were you arguing about with them?" And there's a lot of language about arguing or questioning, or and so I wonder if in this section of Mark, there's a tendency, and maybe this is my own sort of background or issues, but like there's a tendency to assume that arguing is bad, or asking questions is bad, or but what if it's not? What if part of being on the way of Jesus is actually arguing, like even like the disciples who are arguing about who's greatest? Like maybe we don't demonize that necessarily, but we say, isn't this part of what it is to be human, to actually have some skin in the game and to talk seriously about what it means to follow Jesus, or to talk seriously about the place of children in the kingdom of God? I don't know. I was just really struck by the repetition of language about arguing or trying to figure things out, and my tendency to interpret that negatively, and whether or not we should read it negatively, or if there isn't something more positive about discourse, even hard discourse.
Yeah, and just to add on that, like there's a few times where like the disciples kind of shut up and don't ask questions, but also that means that they don't learn anything. I mean, that's maybe an interesting thing too. Like the disciples are like confused after Jesus says some of these things, and they just kind of like stop, you know. Whereas if they would have said, "Hey, I don't know," you know, or "Help me," you know, this like they might have actually. But yeah, in any event, but yeah. So what do you do with that, Mitzi?
Yeah, I agree. I think I wish there was a new translation that would say something more like intense dialogue instead of arguing, right? Because intense dialogue can lead also. Sometimes people want to kill him, and sometimes we want to, you know, we like to defriend people on Facebook. But so intense dialogue, yes. And I think this was a culture, right, that valued dialogue, right?
Yeah.
I think when the Pharisees come to him a lot in dialogue, I think perhaps, seems like I saw a YouTube video not long ago of a rabbi who was teaching about Jesus and the Pharisees, and he said, well, perhaps Jesus was a Pharisee. I think so too. Why did they keep coming to him? Yeah. Right, and having these intense dialogues, I think because he was one of them, right? Perhaps, right? And the intense dialogue is good. It's not good to want to kill each other, and they didn't always want to kill each other, right? And Jesus doesn't try to avoid the dialogue, right? But he encourages it by asking further questions, right?
Yeah. I like that. I just. Again, I think that in our contemporary age, you know, with the desire for unity and everybody to get along on one hand, and then like the toxicity of social media on the other hand, like the church has a lot of room to grow in productive dialogue, even if it is, you know, heartfelt, and even if it gets, you know, emotional, or people are challenged or uncomfortable. Can we do that without like going for the jugular of saying, you know, you're not a real Christian, or you're not a real American, or you're not this, or, you know, can we debate and dialogue without demonizing? That seems to be a real problem. And I don't know if the church is the best place for looking for examples, whether we think of like Paul or Martin Luther or Calvin, like people, we've not always done the best at being able to have intense dialogue and continue it through the long haul, like for the whole journey to Jerusalem in the narrative of Mark. And so, yeah, we got to find that. We'll expect you to give us that new translation, you know, by the spring. Okay. Just.
And maybe the very human Jesus sometimes falls in that trap. You vipers. I don't know. Well, where's that John the Baptist?
Well, yeah, Jesus
has some things to say. Yeah.
Yeah, he does. Yeah.
But yeah, that's yeah. I mean, I do. It is interesting to. I mean, think about the disciples seem to be engaging in good faith here, in the sense that like they do want to figure out what to do. I mean, maybe not all the time, maybe not all of them, but there does seem to be a big difference in my mind. And like when I engage people in dialogue, are they trying to engage? You know, are they trying to actually talk and listen and think together? There are other people who are using what looks like dialogue as an attempt to try to hurt other people. To me, there's like, you know, Jesus doesn't engage with everyone and doesn't answer every question. And sometimes I do think that there's this wisdom to like saying you're trying to hurt with your attempt at fake dialogue, you know. Right. But then there are like times where surprisingly people do engage. I did read this one article in the New York Times about this year-long project they did in Texas, where they found voters that I guess COVID cut this short, but before COVID, I think it was over the span of more than a year, they took voters who were like, you know, on different sides of the American political spectrum and got them together in person. This is again before COVID, but to have a series of dialogues and where they got to know each other. And actually they found out that like, I mean, this radically changed their political perspectives, and, you know, in many cases led to like big shifts in terms of how people identified and so on, you know. But just to say that this kind of like actually talking to people and listening to people like can have huge impact and effect. But we often, like right now, it seems like it's just, thinking of engaging people politically, like many people are staying away from that. But I have found, like, at least for me, like if you can find someone that wants to debate in good faith or engage in conversation, intense dialogue, even in good faith, like there can be some progress made. But one teaching that Jesus gives here, and I just want to note, we've got about 10 minutes left.
10 minutes, yep.
One teaching that I've found a lot of like intense dialogue about in the church, that I also think has led to like some positions on this have led to some harm for people in the church, is Jesus' teachings about divorce in chapter 10, verses 1 through 12. I've heard this used to convince people to stay in abusive relationships, and relationships that were maybe not even physically abusive, but were emotionally abusive, or, I have seen this, kind of used, I think, at least at how I've perceived it, for harm. But how do you all, as New Testament scholars, how do you all interpret Jesus's teachings about divorce here, and how do they engage with kind of modern culture, the modern church?
Yeah, so I never thought about this till this. I mean, I never said this till this moment, that this is coming from a man that maybe was never married.
Yeah, that's right.
Like Paul, right? So, yeah, I mean, I think we have to have, I think sometimes this very human Jesus rightly reinterprets or tradition, right? And thinks about, rethinks tradition. And sometimes he goes along with tradition, and sometimes it seems helpful and not so helpful. Even the notion, right? I think it's problematic because let me tell you, I lived part of my life as a very fundamentalist, literalist, someone who read the scriptures very literal. And I said most of my life I would never marry someone who had never been married before, because that would be adultery, believe it or not. And who did I marry? Someone who had been married twice. Maybe I should have. Anyway, so so there's a problem with that. I think there's also a problem with the whole notion that people try to deal with this idea of one flesh, because the person who usually gives up their identity is a woman, right? Forced to give up her identity, her dreams, and so forth. So that one flesh usually becomes male flesh, right? So yes, I think this is it can be very problematic in a number of ways, right?
Yeah, and just to say that, like, I mean, Jesus is engaging in a kind of conversation that was, at least in Jewish culture at the time, I mean, and still is today in Jewish culture in many ways, like a kind of more of an open-ended conversation that expects response. That is to say, like we can see in the Mishnah and the Talmud, these early Jewish documents that come after the time of Jesus, but they represent conversations that were going on that look very much like the conversations Jesus has with the Pharisees, where there is a give and take. There is kind of someone stakes a position, someone says, no, how about this? And then oftentimes there's a response, how about this? And then how about this? And oftentimes there's people the rabbinic dialogue, which the Pharisees seem to be engaged in that style of conversation. Oftentimes there's like well, what about this? They're almost like proposing ideas. And then someone else responds with kind of a particular situation that limits that or that expands that and so on. But it does seem to me that this conversation ends abruptly, where someone else might say, yeah, but what about this situation? What about this particular situation where it's harmful to someone to stay engaged, in a marriage relationship like this or something like that? It seems like there's other, the Old Testament does actually give reasons for divorce and for separating relationships. And Jesus seems to limit that here, but then that conversation itself seems to be limited. I don't know. I mean, for me, I look at this and I'm like, we're missing half the story. We're missing more, there's more to this conversation. This doesn't follow the typical way that an ancient Jewish conversation would have happened between Pharisees. But I don't know. That's just me.
I think that's a great point. That's a great point. So perhaps we as readers need to continue to have that conversation instead of seeing it as a closed conversation, as a mandate, right? In terms of how we should live our lives, because there is so much here. Even the notion of what God has joined together. Because you got married, God joined you. If you get divorced, then God didn't join you. No, we do the best we can as human beings, right?
Right. Right.
Yeah, so one of the things that strikes me about this passage is that, again, the gender dynamics are apparent. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Is the Pharisees' question, and it seems to be all of the agency is there. It almost can men just push their wives aside? And this is I want to be very clear. This is a place where Christians fall into sort of some anti-Jewish interpretations when they say, that there are the Jews, that Jesus is somehow fighting against the Jewish law that allowed husbands to just get rid of their wives whenever they wanted to, and how we want to be really careful here. But then in verses 10 through 12, Jesus is now in a house with just his disciples. And he seems to offer a slightly different teaching where now the question is both husbands and wife seem to have agency, and it's more about remarriage seems to be the problem. And again, I don't actually know what to make of this other than to say, like, it's interesting that the conversation is slightly different in public, and then in the house there is this other question. And I love what you two are suggesting is that maybe it does encourage us to continue to ask this question, to continue to ask, what does it look like in terms of justice and in terms of equity for us to consider the question of divorce and safety, and making sure that marriages are healthy or whatever. I think that we are invited to open up that question, even if it's not the question in the text, and sort of continue those questions.
Yes, I think we can never forget either that the Bible and religion in general is impacted by culture, and culture and vice versa, right? That culture has a big significant impact on what we're reading in the Bible, and we are living in that culture too, and vice versa. Right?
Yeah, I mean. Right. And with our couple minutes left, I mean, there is this other story that follows after that. We have the Jesus and the little children, but then also the rich man. And I want to spend a couple minutes on this if we have some time. But just to say that, Jesus gives, I have heard this preached, that the eye of a needle was an actual gate in Jerusalem, and that, like, rich people would go through it. I've heard people kind of explain this and try to justify it in many ways, right? That rich people are totally fine, it's okay, and so on. But Jesus does seem to have some hard things to say that do make this young man go away grieving, right? How do we understand Jesus' teachings about wealth and possessions? In light of what we've learned, we also recently did a study on the letter of James, and so we talked about wealth and possessions in the early church some. But what does Jesus' teaching have to do with both the ancient context, but also with our own lives today?
This is one of my favorite texts to go to when I'm helping people understand that nobody interprets all of the Bible literally. Because when I'm teaching local pastors, for example, in the United Methodist Church, and we're talking about varieties of ways of interpretation, I'll say, "Is that your computer? Can I have it? Did you drive a car to class this morning? Can I have it?" Because the literal reading of this text is, you cannot be a disciple of Jesus and own things, or at least that seems to be what Jesus says. And then I look around me, and I live in the 21st century context, and it forces, I think, the conversation about what is interpretation. How do we actually live this out? And I think that there's a variety of answers that can be offered, but I at least want people, and actually, Mitzi, this is a language that you use in your textbook. I want my students to recognize their agency as interpreters. I want them to know that they are active in the process of interpretation. And so they have to wrestle with, okay, I own stuff. Does that mean I'm not a disciple of Christ? Or what's going on? And we begin to have a conversation. So that's more like probably me squirreling away from the answer, Brennan, to your question.
This is one we all squirrel away from sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is hard. So you know what? It's a struggle in the society in which we live, right? I wonder if part of the question is really, does my owning, right, or in what way does my owning contribute to poverty?
Mm.
Right, perhaps that's another way to ask.
Mm-hmm.
Am I learning to just amass things? Let's say Americans own more stuff and waste more stuff and buy more stuff than we don't need, right? You know, how is my owning? How is my amassing? And wealth is relative, right?
Mm-hmm.
Contributing to poverty could be the question, right? And if I'm amassing to amass to have, well, and am sort of and have no regard for those in poverty and how they're poor. I mean, we cannot have the poor that we have without people having more than they should and need. I use that word should kind of trying to use it very carefully, but I mean it showed us a recent article and the huge profits that corporations made, even during the recession, continued to make huge profits, even during the pandemic, and give bigger and bigger salaries to executives, even during the pandemic, while more and more people are being evicted, right? That should be a problem. Right. Grateful for Florida that passed the $15 an hour. You know, hopefully it will stay in step with the cost of living, right? But yeah. So the question is, how do I use my wealth, wealth of knowledge, wealth of goods, and so forth, to create a more equal, a society where there is not this poverty. You know, poverty doesn't happen on its own. We create poverty, and what we create, we can fix. I believe, right? If we want to.
Yeah, it's a bit, I mean, to me, it's a bit like the request of James and John, where Jesus says, well, you know that these Gentiles lord their power over other people. And that, you know, Jesus isn't saying that people shouldn't have positions of authority or something like that. I don't think, like, you know, someone's got to be in charge of our water system. Someone's got to be in charge of, you know, our school, or, you know, whatever. But the issue is not like people have positions of kind of some power or authority, but the question is, how are you using this? What are you using it for? What's the effect? What do you know, are you doing this so that you can be a tyrant, or so that you can acquire wealth, or so that you can, you know, make your status higher and so on? And what's the effect of it, right? What are you doing with this, and how is it affecting other people's lives? I mean, it is interesting. There's a biblical scholar, Ekaputra Tupamahu, who just had an article that he published online, about possession and ownership, and theories of possession and ownership that emerged really in Europe in the early modern period. That are part of white supremacy, that are part of a white supremacist culture, and that has, like, you know, in some ways skewed like how biblical scholars read even things, or even think about like things like authorship. And he talks about like the kind of obsession with authorship in New Testament studies, also Old Testament studies we could add to that, and this notion of like who owns it, you know. But whereas like ancient people would be like, no one owns this book, you know, like you know, no one, like that notion of authorship, ownership, and copyright and stuff is a, you know. So anyway, thinking about kind of ownership, authorship, power, authority, and things like that. I mean, some of that might help us to think too about how we might intersect with some of these texts about power and wealth in the world. I'm sorry, we're over time. Yeah, sorry.
I know we're over time. I was just going to say one thing that stuck out to me while we were talking is in 21 it says that Jesus looked at him and loved him, and so he asked this question. He makes this statement in a spirit of love, which means however we interpret this story. It seems that Jesus has this person's best interest in mind. That's how I would interpret the question of love, or the word of love.
And also the position of authority, like, and like, this is bad. I mean, like, but part of the issue of like white supremacy is that like it's bad for white people too. It's like this is an unhealthy system for the entire world to exist in. But also like our system of corporate greed. Like it's bad for the people on top too. They're not having fun, right? They think they are, right? Sometimes, but all to say that to love people sometimes is actually to call things out and to say this is does that make sense? I mean,
I think that's right.
I think it's a problem too to equate poverty with heaven, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it helps to justify, right, the poverty that we create, right? And we usually, it's good for people who are poor.
Yeah.
And if he sells everything, he becomes poor. So is somebody else supposed to give all they have, right? So I think we have to rethink these things, right? This notion of poor people are automatically, their poverty is spiritualized, right? And not connecting it with, part of being human is you have real physical needs, right? You can't continue to exist without them. You can't exist in healthy, peaceful ways, right? Living in poverty, right? Is that supposed to be heaven, right? It's supposed to equate with heaven. While on the other hand, wealth is connected also sometimes with being in right relationship with God or being in God's good graces and favor, right?
Yeah. Right. And like this, this connects kind of to the beginning of our conversation too, about suffering, that this discourse about suffering in the New Testament can be used to justify the suffering of people who have been oppressed and have been made vulnerable and so on, and saying, oh, well, they're more spiritual because they're poor or something, or because they're vulnerable, etc. But so all of these situations we've seen, like in these texts, can be used both in a liberatory way and in an oppressive way. I mean, like the discussion about suffering and violence, the discussion about wealth and the discussion about privilege and authority and so on. These can be used to justify or to condemn, or to liberate. I mean, that is to say, and the discussion of divorce as well. You can read that in a way where it's Jesus is trying to protect women, in this particular way that this question was asked, from being cast out just because the husband doesn't like them or something. Like that is, we can think about that. But all of these require wisdom, it seems, right? Thinking about this and actually trying to see, like, well, what's the lived effect of this, right? Yeah. Fascinating. Yeah.
All right. Well, we have taken 7 extra minutes of
sorry, Mitzi.
time, more than she committed to. Thank you very much. Thanks to those of you who joined us on Facebook and on Zoom, and who will watch this at some point in the next several days. We are so grateful for these conversations. Again, Mitzi, thank you so much for
Thank you both.
Opening up the text again for us. And next week, everyone, we wrap up our study of Mark with chapters 11 through 16. We'll be joined by Chris Skinner, who teaches at Loyola University in Chicago. So thanks, everyone. And
thank you so much.
Have a great week.
And may we also say to Mitzi, thank you so much for taking time from your sabbatical. My prayer for you is that the rest of your sabbatical is somehow miraculously more restful than it's been so far.
Yes, me too.
From your mouth to God's ear, yes.
Maybe so. Maybe so. Thank you again.
Bye.
Peace, y'all.
Bye, y'all.